1 week on from the Wagner mercenary group's aborted mutiny in Russia, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has dubbed the failed rebellion a misadventure. Moscow's top diplomats stressed to foreign media that Russia would come out of the uprising stronger than before. Yevgeny Prigozhin's mercenaries came within 200 kilometers of Moscow last weekend, only to stand down after a deal brokered by Belarus's Alexander Lukashenko. Wagner mercenaries have taken a leading role in Russia's war in Ukraine, but the group is also active in Syria and Africa. Lavrov said that Wagner mercenaries would continue to operate in African countries if regional governments there wanted to maintain contacts with the group.
The future of the agreements between African countries and the Wagner private military company is above all up to the governments of the countries concerned. They decide whether they would be interested in continuing this form of cooperation to ensure the authorities' security.
Now, the United States says it's concerned about Wagner's destabilizing influence in Africa and has accused its leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, of helping engineer the departure of UN troops from Mali. The UN voted today to withdraw from Mali as demanded by the military leadership there. The junta brought Wagner into Mali to help battle an Islamist insurgency. The mercenary group has been accused of atrocities in Mali and in a number of African countries.
There is evidence that mercenaries from the Wagner Group operate in at least 4 African countries: Sudan, the Central African Republic, Mali and Libya. In Libya, the mercenaries joined warlord Khalifa Haftar and his national army, who are fighting to seize power from the UN-recognised Government of National Accord. Accounts from former Wagner soldiers have linked the mercenaries to the shooting of civilians and fighters who had surrendered. Wagner members also placed booby traps and unmarked mines in civilian areas. The UN accuses them of committing war crimes. The violence is forcing thousands to flee. Italy's defence minister claims Wagner is encouraging migrants to cross to Europe in an attempt to destabilise the continent. In Sudan, Wagner soldiers have long trained its army and advised its political leaders. This has helped advance its economic interests. A Sudanese company linked to Wagner has gained gold mining concessions and government approval for a gold processing facility. The outbreak of fighting in Sudan presented Wagner with a dilemma. Worried about backing the wrong side, the group is training government forces while also arming rebel RSF fighters. In the Central African Republic, the Wagner Group has been propping up the government of President Faustin Archange Touadéra against various rebel groups who control large parts of the country. A United Nations investigation found that government forces and Wagner fighters killed dozens of civilians in a mosque in 2021. Wagner militants are also accused of torture, kidnappings and mass rape, and that they use violence to control and exploit areas rich in gold, diamonds and other valuable minerals. Again, Russian companies appear to benefit from the mercenaries' involvement. Wagner's arrival coincided with a company linked to its founder being awarded diamond and gold mining licenses. Mali's military junta has been fighting a long-standing insurgency by Islamist groups. About 1,000 Wagner mercenaries have been deployed to train Malian soldiers and protect the junta, with access to uranium, diamond and gold mines as likely payoffs. And here too the UN says they have committed atrocities. The Kremlin used to play down its links to the activities of the Wagner Group in Africa. Now it's promised the continued support of its state mercenaries there.
And for a closer look at the Wagner Group in Africa, I'm joined now by Kimberly Martin. She's a professor of political science at Columbia University's Harriman Institute. Thank you so much for joining us. You've been following the Wagner Group for quite some time. How did they become so powerful on the African continent?
with Russian help. They are not really a private military company. They are really an arm of the Russian state. And every single contract that they have in Africa, in Syria, everywhere else that they have been, it has been done through negotiation with Russian diplomats and with other Russian ministries like the energy ministry in Syria.
Where is that cooperation left now after this coup?
We don't know for sure, but I think it's really interesting that Sergei Lavrov, in the quote that you had just a few moments ago, said he named the Wagner Group by name, which is the first time that we've had Russia admit that the Wagner Group is actually in Africa, to my knowledge. Because the Wagner Group is playing such an important role in both the Central African Republic and in Mali in terms of shoring up the leadership there, my guess is that they are going to be maintained, and also in Eastern Africa, working for the warlord Khalifa Haftar, who controls the eastern part of the country. In the Central African Republic, they are what keeps the government in power. There's just no question that they have brought a level of stability to the government that it would not have otherwise. Mali, it's too early to know how successful they'll be, but that's what they're trying to do.
So from a Western perspective, Wagner has been a destabilizing agent. But from what you're saying, it seems like from the inside, it must feel like they are stabilizing somehow. So with this reshuffling going on now and parts of Wagner being integrated, or there being attempts of parts of Wagner being integrated into the Russian military, where is that role left then?
So the stability has come from stabilizing autocratic leadership. It's not that has left them unstable in the Central African Republic. It's that they've committed terrible human rights violations in order to get where they are now. In Mali, they may in fact be destabilizing things because Wagner was responsible earlier for kicking out the French presence there that was engaged in counterterrorism activities, and most recently, as your report indicated, for causing the United Nations Security Council approved peace mission to now be on its way out at the end of the year. You know, we're not sure what this means for the future, but because it is a creature of the Russian military intelligence unit, and because Prigozhin has had his role, not because of his talents, not because of any combat experience, but because of his support by Vladimir Putin, my guess is it would be pretty easy to replace Prigozhin with somebody else. And that there's no particular reason why anything needs to change in the deployments in Africa as a result of what happened in Russia this past week.
But the governments of countries like, you know, Mali, Libya, all the countries that we're looking at right now, they do have contracts with Wagner, and Wagner has these mining licenses that we heard about in the report. Would it be easy for someone else to just swoop in there and say, hey, now we're taking over?
The contracts are not with Wagner because Wagner technically doesn't exist. The contracts are with a series of companies that Prigozhin has set up. So I'm not sure who could swoop in or why they would want somebody else to swoop in. Wagner has just immense control over these contracts in Russia, and it's not Prigozhin as an individual that matters so much as what the Wagner fighters and the Wagner security guards are bringing. So I think the biggest question is whether these governments are willing to share sufficient information with other agents in Russia to allow them to take over. How much of this was just in Prigozhin's head versus how much was written down or is available elsewhere. And then most importantly, whether the Wagner forces on the ground are so loyal to Prigozhin that in his absence, they would refuse to keep on fighting. I don't think that's the case. They've known all along that they're actually fighting for Russia. They're Russian patriots. They are really good at what they do, and they're not good at much else. And so my guess is that things are likely to continue pretty much as they have been, with or without Prigozhin being the one in control.
Now, looking back at what we saw unfold over the weekend, some analysts believe that Africa is actually where the tensions between Wagner and Moscow first started to show. Would you agree?
We do have the one interesting piece of evidence today that somebody fired on the Wagner base camp in eastern Libya. The Libyan UN-recognized government claims that they did not do it, that they have maintained the ceasefire. So that's an interesting thing to look at. It's interesting to also look at Syria, where there are reports that some of the Wagner individuals, at least, have been put under house arrest or have been questioned by some combination of Russian security security forces and Libyan, in that case, Syrian intelligence forces. There were reports of some tensions between the Russian Foreign Ministry and Wagner in the Central African Republic, but I think the general conclusion to that was that was infighting within the Russian government, not between the Russian state and Wagner. And it makes sense that the Foreign Ministry might not be happy with the role that the GRU and the Russian military establishment is taking over control of a country where Russia still has a diplomatic mission from the foreign minister.
As political scientist Kimberly Martin, thank you so much for all that.
Thank you.
John Lechner is a freelance journalist and researcher. He has a book on the Wagner Group coming out in 2024. Mr. Lechner, welcome to DW. The UN Security Council has voted to end the MINUSMA peacekeeping mission. What does that mean for Wagner's role in Mali?
Thank you for having me. It's a good question at this point. I think first thing that is we have to define exactly what we think Wagner's mandate is in Mali. And I think it's safe to say that the Malian regime did not believe or does not believe that Wagner, with about 1,400 contractors in the country, is going to be able to replace the UN peacekeeping force, nor did they necessarily think that they were going to replace the French Operation Barkhane previously. And so I think that ultimately it's more likely that the main concern of the Malian government right now is its own political legitimacy in the capital, Bamako, and the protection around its own regime, which Wagner can provide.
Yeah, let's broaden the scope a bit. How much of a destabilizing force has Wagner proved to be in the countries where it has been operating? Because they have been accused of pushing the Malian government, for example, to push out the UN peacekeepers.
It's a great question. I think at first we have to understand that mercenaries tend to be a symptom of an illness. They're never the illness themselves. And so private military companies, mercenary forces are going to arrive in theaters that tend to already be in conflict. That being said, I think it's clear that in the instance of Mali, the Wagner Group has not been able to bring any type of stability to the country. To be fair as well, neither has the French intervention or the UN peacekeeping force. But I think that ultimately they're keeping intact a lot of the patterns that have made the conflict so difficult in the first place.
Russia always claimed Wagner operated beyond its jurisdiction, but really how involved was the Kremlin in Wagner operations in Africa?
In Africa, as you said, it very much depends on the countries involved. And so I think even within Africa, we have to differentiate Libya from the Central African Republic and likely Mali as well. In Libya, Wagner's support for General Khalifa Haftar when he was trying to take Tripoli from the GNA government, we saw quite heavy equipment. We saw Wagner pilots in Sukhoi jets. That's not the type of government equipment that we see in the Central African Republic. And in Mali, I believe a lot of the equipment is coming in from China. And so the level of support is actually quite fluid, I think, depending on what Moscow's strategic interests in the countries are.
Sergei Lavrov says that Wagner's future in Africa depends solely on the countries concerned, but all governments that rely on Wagner's military support have close ties to Moscow as well. So what would a continued presence mean for relations with Russia?
Well, I'm trying to figure out this question myself. I think it's important to note that we're still in such early stages at this point that I'm honestly not sure that Yevgeny Prigozhin, Lavrov, or the African governments themselves know exactly where this is going to go or how it's going to play out. I think in some areas, potentially like the Central African Republic, Wagner has other businesses that it's set up that could be self-sustaining. But then again, the question would come, what kind of state support would they get for procuring equipment from the Russian military? Where would they get that type of equipment down the line? So these are the questions that we're going to be looking for in the future to kind of read into the tea leaves.
Yeah, what a time to write a book about the Wagner Group. That was John Lechner, expert on the mercenaries. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.